when we talk about mission and poverty and justice in a middle-class environment like this, I always get kind of nervous. I'd like to invite some people into the room with us to help, in some ways, to keep us honest, to make this discussion more honest. I'd like to invite people like Samuel. Samuel, these are some people I just met in the last few months. I met Samuel last month. He's a 3-year-old indigenous kid in Brazil. And he and his mom, Maria, have moved to the city of Manaus because the rural village that they lived in the forest was destroyed by loggers. And so they had to move to the city. And part of the work I was doing as a journalist in Brazil last month was looking at the phenomenon of urban Indians, of what happens to indigenous families and communities when they're displaced by economic development that has sped up in Brazil in the last few months with the election of a new president, Bolsonaro. So I want to bring Samuel into the room. I'd like to bring in these children who are kids going to school in Mosul, a city in Iraq. This was in, I think, December. Mosul was destroyed during the occupation by the Islamic State group and then by the war against ISIS by the United States and the Peshmerga, the Iraqi military. And yet in the middle of that rubble, there are families that are going on with life, and including kids going back to school. And parents and teachers in Mosul are really worried about those kids, not just because of all the hardship they've had to face physically, but about the lessons they've learned of having lived under the caliphate for 2 years, and then having seen a military solution to that problem. What are the kinds of attitudes that they take forward in terms of violence and abuse and relationships between them and so on? So I invite these children from Mosul into the room with us. This is Ibrahim. He's a 2-year-old boy who I met last year in South Sudan. His father was killed by South Sudanese soldiers. He was burned to death in his hut. And Samuel lives today in a displaced persons camp run by a Catholic church in the south of the country. I want to invite in this woman. This is Irma Locasia, who's holding a photo of her son Salvador. Salvador was killed. They live in the Philippines, and he was killed by the official death squads of the Duterte government, part of the Philippine government's, quote, war on drugs, which has led to the extrajudicial execution of more than 20,000 people in the last 3 years. So I invite her into this room. And by the way, she's part of a case against Duterte in the International Criminal Court, which is being shepherded by some United Methodist deaconesses, asking that the Duterte government be brought to justice because of this. And then finally, I'd like to bring in Ivana Skatunzi, who's a refugee from Rwanda, who lives in Durham, South Carolina. And part of her life as a refugee in the United States is to learn how to ride a bike. So I'd like to invite all of those people into the room with us this morning. And I would pray that the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts would be acceptable in their sight. O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I'm going to get the water. We like to fix things. If something breaks in our house, we feel good when we can fix it, whether it's a leaky faucet or a squeaky kid. We're proud of what we can accomplish. My father-in-law used to spend his Saturdays tinkering around the house, fixing whatever needed to be fixed, whether it was the plumbing or a hinge or new paint. And he had this t-shirt that he proudly wore, that said, "I can fix anything." And that shirt got old over the years and in tatters, but every Saturday morning he would put it on and he would start tinkering. And I thought it was so cool that one year for Christmas, I got my mother-in-law an identical shirt that said, "I can fix anyone." And for some reason, she never wore it. In the church, we have often confused mission with fixing things, whether the problem is a lack of food or a lack of faith. We send volunteering mission teams to every corner of the world. They're matching t-shirts proclaiming that the world would be a much better place if we would just do things their way. There can be a tremendous arrogance about mission and about missionaries. And not surprisingly, that means that mission, instead of fixing things, can often make things worse, can increase the brokenness of our world. This arrogance in mission means that we can and will misunderstand the world, distort the gospel, and provide ideological justification for conquest, even for genocide. The scripture passage that we just heard read this morning helps us to rethink mission, and it begins with a demand that we stay awake. And I apologize that this, by the way, is a passage that we normally read in Lent, which we just finished. I'm always 2 or 3 weeks behind with things, so pardon me. So here's a scene. It's after the Last Supper and before the crucifixion. Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. He goes there with Peter, James, and John, his 3 best friends, and he's really wrestling with what he knows is going to happen, and he's not really crazy about it. And he would actually like for God to come up with some sort of plan B. There's some way he can get out of this. And so he wrestles with what is faith and what's going to happen, and he comes to find his friends who invited there with him sleeping. He wakes them up. You remember the story? He wakes them up and says, "Please, can you just stay awake with me?" And then he goes on praying, and he comes back to find them asleep again. He says, "Can't you guys wake up?" He goes back to pray even more, that anguished prayer, and he comes back and he finds them sleeping a 3rd time. And he says, "Can't you just stay awake with me?" Now I want you to notice what Jesus does not do in this story. He does not ask his friends to solve his problem. He does not ask them to pick up swords to fight against the soldiers who are going to come to arrest him. He does not ask them to call up their friends in the government and see if they can get him off the hook. He doesn't ask them to tweet about his situation. He doesn't ask them to sneak out the back gate of the garden with him to get away from the soldiers. Nor does he tell them that it's useless, that there's nothing that they can do, that they should just go home, that whatever is going to happen is going to happen. Instead, he says that there is something they can do. They can stay awake. They can wait with him. As the late Father Daniel Berrigan once said, "Don't just do something, stand there." Now, if you've ever had a loved one die from an illness, you know what he meant. You can't do anything to change the diagnosis. The best thing you can do is simply to remain at their bedside quietly, peacefully, so that they know you are there. Some call this being present, or they talk about a ministry of presence. What's important to being present is that we shut our mouths and we listen. The persons or persons we accompany then get to set the agenda. This is certainly true in relationships, and I've had to learn in my own marriage to resist the temptation to solve my wife's problems for her. But rather than stand here and confess my own sins, let's see how our culture's quintessential husband comes to this realization.
And when something's bothering you, sometimes I should just say, "I understand," instead of trying to fix it, because all you really need is someone to know what you're feeling.
That is really, really lovely.
Homer's spirit, I think, helps inform our understanding of mission, whether it's here or abroad. Latin Americans have long helped us to resist talking about mission the way we've traditionally done it, as a paternalistic effort to save people from sin or poverty, suggesting instead that we talk about mission as accompaniment. That rather than rushing to fix people's problems for them with what we think is best for them, we practice the art of listening, of being present, of simply staying awake. The more we stay awake and listen, the more likely we are not to violate the first rule of both Hippocrates and John Wesley: do no harm. This is particularly difficult, however, for some of us who've grown up in an environment that encourages activism. But doing no harm means preceding activism with active listening. So who do we listen to? A few verses earlier, the gospel writer Matthew records Jesus telling us that if we want to meet him in our own time, we will find him with those who are hungry, thirsty, naked, and in prison. This is critical to understanding today's passage. We are challenged to stay awake with Jesus as he, in our time, approaches us and the people at the edges of our community. Staying awake with Jesus means being willing to be at the edge where the poor live. I was recently in El Salvador, in San Salvador, working on a story about gangs, and I told a taxi driver that I wanted to go to a particular neighborhood, and he refused to take me. He said it wasn't safe, and I argued, I offered him more money, and he kept refusing. Finally, I called the priest that I was going to meet in that neighborhood, and I put him on the phone to the taxi driver. And he carefully explained to the taxi driver what route to take, and if we were stopped by gang members on the way in, that to say we were on the way to the church and that we were going to see Father Carlos. Because of the work that the church is doing in that neighborhood, it's seen as neutral territory by the gangs that control the neighborhood. The church has earned that trust by being willing to accompany the poor. So the taxi driver finally got me to the church. And when I asked the priest about why he took such a great risk to stand with the poor, he said, it doesn't make sense to remember someone crucified 2,000 years ago if we're not willing to accompany those who are crucified today. The problem here is that we in the middle class, we like to talk about the poor and hungry from a safe distance, where we can easily analyze and solve their problems before we even understand their problems. And when we do try to bridge the gap, we do so often on our own terms. So we love to send volunteer teams to exotic places like Guatemala to do something for the poor, to build churches or clinics or other landmarks of what some call the Great White Savior Industrial Complex. While at the same time, we gripe about paying more for a pound of coffee that would allow those communities to build their own churches and their own clinics. And Rhonda nods at this, by the way. So when I bitch about volunteer mission teams, Rhonda, I think, understands the problem here. And to build their own healthcare. So let's be honest, we really love mercy more than we do justice. The problem for us is that God prefers justice. So when people ask, however, about justice in a hemisphere where free trade agreements allow mining companies from the north to pillage those mountain villages in Guatemala, or where climate change inflicts devastating losses on small coffee farmers there, driving some of them to flee north with their families as a way to survive, we get understandably sleepy. Who wants to talk about free trade agreements? We'd much rather talk about who the Seahawks chose in the NFL draft than to think about our complicity in an unjust international economic system. Just that phrase, unjust international economic system, is enough to make me sleepy, and I'm the one who said it. So staying awake, however, is not just a matter of hearing, it's also a matter of seeing. And we know from some neuroimaging studies at Duke and Princeton that we have been schooled not to see poverty. They do this thing where they attach an MRI that they can watch what goes on in your brain in real time. And they can see where the synapses fire in your brain. And they show people a picture of a person that they know, for example. And they see that the synapses fire in one part of the brain that recognizes human beings. And then they show you a picture of a chair or a rock. And the synapses fire in a different part of the brain where you recognize objects. And then they show you a picture of a poor person, maybe a homeless person at the stoplight. And where do the synapses fire? They fire in the object recognition sector of the brain. We have literally been schooled into not seeing poor people as people, but to seeing them as objects, into objectifying the poor, removing their humanity. And if we can't see the poor, we can't see Jesus. And he'll be born in our midst one more time, and like people 2,000 years ago, we won't recognize him. We just journeyed, you all just journeyed through Lent, which is a period in which we supposedly reprogram our brain so that we can truly see Jesus in our neighbor. And there's no better way, I would suggest, for us to do that than through accompaniment, of intentionally seeking the company of those we have been schooled not to see. The word accompaniment comes from the Latin phrase ad companus, which could be translated as breaking bread together. It's hard to hate someone you break bread with. That's why a lot of folks who grew up thinking that it was okay to discriminate against LGBTQ people, for example, change their perspective once they actually get to know someone who's gay, once their child announces who's coming to dinner. In the same way, it's hard to ignore that person holding the sign at the stoplight if you've shared a cup of coffee with them. There's another story in the Gospels, and this is a post-Lent story. You're welcome, Pastor, for this. Of how some rather depressed disciples discovered that it was Jesus that they had been walking and talking with all along that road to Emmaus. Here's the central point of the Gospel's post-Easter message. These clowns didn't know it was Jesus until they shared a meal, until they broke bread with him. So being engaged in mission, whether here in Eastern Washington or somewhere on the other side of the world where the lions and the llamas are, means staying awake, listening, seeing, opening our lives to be blessed as we break bread with the poor and thus encounter Jesus. We need to be clear, however, that this accompaniment is neither easy nor is it without cost. Are we willing to pay a price for that? We live in a historical moment when greed and hatred are crushing the poor and turning our planet quickly into a wasteland. Are we willing to be uncomfortable, to sacrifice privilege that we enjoy in order to stand with the poor? Martin Niemöller wrestled with this question. He was a Lutheran pastor in Germany, leading a nice, comfortable life, and he decided one day to resist the Third Reich. And I've been to the room that he shared with other prisoners at Dachau, where they imprisoned him, and where he wrote this famous poem that I'm sure you've heard. First they came for the socialists, he wrote, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. What Niemöller understood is that it did no good to worship God if we're not willing to stay awake and stand with God's children when they are threatened. That understanding, that solidarity cost him his privilege and landed him in a Nazi prison. So in our day, today, in the United States, as refugees and immigrants and the environment are under grave threat, we may not be able to fix the hatred that has come to permeate our political discourse, but we can stand with those who are threatened by it. So because of our belief in Jesus Christ as the Lord of life, we are called to declare in our own time that if they come for the Jews, we are Jews. If they come for the Muslims, we are Muslims. If they come for our LGBTQ sisters and brothers, we are all queer. And if they come for the planet, we are the trees and the rivers and the volcanoes. As the priest in San Salvador told me, if it doesn't make sense to remember someone crucified 2,000 years ago, if we're not willing to stand with those who are crucified today. So who's crucified today? Can we hear them? Can we see them? Can we stay awake and stand with them? A short time ago, tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of refugees from Syria and other war-torn places started arriving on the shores of Greek islands, crossing the Aegean Sea in flimsy rafts. Many didn't make it. And the world didn't pay much attention at first, but when it did, it took governments and humanitarian organizations a long time to respond. In the meantime, it was ordinary Greek fishers and farmers, and then volunteers who started arriving from all over Europe, who came to the beaches and started pulling people from the sea. They responded because they were awake to the real plight of real people, and they made a commitment to leave their ordinary lives and jobs behind to accompany the refugees as they fled from terror. Now, one of the people that they helped to pull ashore was this man. His name is Nabil Ninas. He and his family, they're Christians from Syria, and I met them on a rocky beach in Lesbos. They came and one of the first things they did as they landed on that rocky beach was Nabil got his wife and two daughters on the shore where they were hugged by, I can't remember what slide. This is the first time I've done this actually. He got his wife and daughters onto the shore where they were hugged by Norwegian women. There was a whole contingent of Norwegian women on the shore, and their main job was to hug people as they got off the boats, particularly women and kids, because women and kids were in the middle of the rafts, and when rafts took on water, they were the ones that got wet because they were sitting on the floor rather than up on the sides. And so they were sopping wet and they were shivering. And so this whole contingent of Norwegian women would just come and hug them, finally get them calmed down, get them warm, and then get them into dry clothes. So when Nabil finally gets his wife and daughters warmly hugged, he kneels down on the shore, which is the rocks are covered with the black rubber of rafts that have come earlier and have been deflated. And he kneels and he raises his hands to the sky, he crosses himself, and he repeats over and over, shukran, shukran, the Arabic word for thank you, thank you. He then gets up and he comes to this woman, whose name is Lisbeth, who's hugging his family. And he gives her a big hug, all the while weeping and saying, shukran, shukran, shukran. And then he turns to me, this guy that's just sitting there taking photos of him. And he comes and whether I like it or not, he gives me a big hug. And I still remember the raspy feel of his beard, and he got the front of me sopping wet. And as he wept and said, shukran, shukran, and hugged me. I want to thank you all for supporting my work as a missionary, because you gave me the opportunity to meet Nabil. It's your support for the mission work of the United Methodist Church that made that possible. If I could, I would bring with me this morning his wet embrace and share it with you. It's the loving embrace of the poor, of those who suffer. The water in it is baptismal water, marking our conversion anew to the gospel of Jesus Christ, our blessing as children of God as we open ourselves up to embracing the poor. So receive Nabil's embrace and be blessed by it. Practice accompaniment. Stay awake. Amen.